Right now, if you wanted the strongest, most durable concrete money could buy, you'd call an engineer. You wouldn't call an archaeologist. But you'd be making a mistake. Because the concrete holding up a dome in Rome right now, poured by hand 2,000 years ago, is outperforming almost everything we pour today. Modern concrete starts crumbling in about 50 years. We spend billions maintaining it. The Pantheon has survived earthquakes, floods, and 2 millennia of neglect, and it's still standing. You can walk into it this afternoon. For a long time, nobody could explain why. The recipe was known: volcanic ash, seawater, lime, but the durability wasn't. Then in January 2023, a team at MIT led by Admir Masick looked closer at something everyone had dismissed for a century: small white flecks scattered through the material, long assumed to be evidence of sloppy mixing. They weren't sloppy at all. They were the mechanism. When a crack forms, it travels straight into the nearest fleck. Water dissolves it, creates a calcium-rich solution, and that solution hardens back into solid stone, sealing the crack from the inside automatically, with nobody doing a thing. Roman concrete doesn't resist damage. It repairs itself, and we only figured out how, in a lab, 2 years ago. So if the Romans could accidentally engineer a self-healing material, what else did they build that we've mistaken for a mistake? There's a drinking cup in the British Museum from the 4th century that looks like an ordinary piece of green Roman glass. Hold a light behind it, and the entire thing turns blood red. For most of the 20th century, historians assumed this was carved gemstone, not glass. They didn't even confirm the material until 1950. It took another few decades and a transmission electron microscope to find the actual answer. The glass is threaded with gold and silver nanoparticles, roughly 70 nanometers wide, mixed directly into the molten glass while it was still liquid. At that scale, the metal doesn't just tint the glass, it interacts directly with the physics of light. That's not a decorative trick. That's nanotechnology, achieved with 0 instruments capable of showing the people making it what they were actually doing at that scale. In 2013, researchers at the University of Illinois used that exact nanostructure to build a working chemical sensor. The Romans built something functionally close to that, 16 centuries early, in a wine cup. Here's what's strange, though. Knowing how to do something and choosing to protect it are 2 very different instincts. And 400 years after that cup was made, one empire took that second instinct and turned it into policy. In 672 AD, a Byzantine fleet facing annihilation by a much larger Arab navy unleashed a weapon nobody had ever seen: liquid fire, sprayed from tubes mounted on their ships that burned on top of the water itself. Sailors who jumped overboard to escape it were followed into the sea by flames that kept burning. It became the empire's defining weapon for the next 800 years. Feared enough that entire fleets reportedly turned back at just the rumor it was waiting for them. And then, when Constantinople finally fell in 1453, the formula simply ceased to exist. It had been the single most closely guarded state secret in Byzantine history, known to a handful of people at any given time, and none of them wrote it down. Modern chemists have tried petroleum, pine resin, sulfur, quicklime, saltpeter, every plausible combination, and nobody has matched every property historical accounts describe. Some of those properties actually contradict each other, chemically speaking, which is part of why, more than 1,000 years later, it's still unsolved. An empire didn't lose a piece of technology by accident. It made the deliberate choice to let it die rather than let it spread. That's a strange kind of achievement. Building something so effective that erasing it felt like the safer option. Not everything vanished on purpose, though. Some of it just ran out. Sometime in the early Middle Ages, swordsmiths in the Middle East began forging blades with a distinctive swirling pattern across the surface, and a reputation that outpaced belief. A blade so sharp it could reportedly split a falling silk scarf just from the weight of the fabric landing on the edge. In 2006, German researchers examined a genuine fragment of one of these blades under an electron microscope and found structures resembling carbon nanotubes, a material we only formally identified in 1991. It's worth being honest about this one. That finding is still disputed. Some materials scientists argue the imaging was misread. What isn't disputed is what happened next. Around 1750, the specific ore used to produce these blades ran out, or the trade routes carrying it collapsed, and the technique went with it. Blacksmiths have spent nearly 3 centuries trying to recreate it. Some have come close. Nobody has matched both the structure and the performance of the originals because nobody knows exactly which variable made the accident happen in the first place, which raises an uncomfortable question. If a civilization can lose a technique that advanced simply because a supply chain broke, what happens to knowledge that was never written down to begin with? What happens to it when the only people who understood it disappear without explaining themselves? In 1901, a group of Greek sponge divers working a shipwreck off a small island came up with statues, pottery, and a shapeless, corroded lump of bronze that nobody thought twice about. It was catalogued, boxed, and left in storage for months while the museum's attention stayed on the more obviously valuable finds. Then someone noticed the lump had cracked open. Inside were dozens of precision-cut bronze gears, interlocking with an accuracy that had no business existing on a vessel that sank around 65 BC. It turned out to be an analog computer. At least 30 gears arranged to track the sun, the moon, and the 5 visible planets, predict solar and lunar eclipses, and model the moon's irregular orbit, something that requires understanding orbital mechanics well enough to translate it directly into metal by hand. Nothing this mechanically sophisticated appears again in the historical record for roughly 1,400 years. That's the equivalent of finding a working laptop in a Viking burial mound. For 100 years, all anyone could study was the outside of the corrosion. Then, in 2005, CT scanning let researchers look inside it and found nearly 3,500 characters of ancient Greek text engraved on internal plates. A user's manual, sitting unread for 2,000 years, because nobody had the technology to look inside the object without destroying it. And here's the detail that should actually bother you. This wasn't a sacred, one-of-a-kind object kept somewhere protected. It was cargo. It was being shipped across the Mediterranean like ordinary freight on a boat that also happened to be carrying wine jars and marble statues, which means it wasn't unique. It means devices like it existed in enough quantity that shipping one felt unremarkable. So where are the others? Bronze was valuable, and once Rome needed weapons more than astronomical instruments, old scientific devices were melted down and recast without a second thought. This one only survived because it sank. It was mistaken for scrap for 2,000 years, and then mistaken for scrap again, in a museum storeroom for 2 more. There's a pattern running underneath every one of these. None of them are the work of a lost super-civilization, and none of them required anything we'd call magic. They're the result of small groups of specialists, a glassmaker, a metallurgist, a court engineer, who solved one narrow problem so completely that it took the rest of the world over 1,000 years to catch up. And in every case, the knowledge didn't survive the people who had it. It didn't get written into a book that lasted. It didn't get taught widely enough to outlive a single collapsed trade route, a single conquered city, a single generation of apprentices who died before they could pass it on. We tend to imagine progress as a line that only moves forward. But that's not what the evidence says. It says progress is fragile and reversible, and entirely dependent on whether anyone bothers to write things down before the people who understand them are gone. Somewhere between a Roman glassworks and a Byzantine naval officer swearing an oath of secrecy, a version of the future got quietly deleted. And the only reason we know it existed at all is because a handful of objects happened to survive by accident. Sunk, buried, sealed in bronze, mistaken for something worthless long enough to never get melted down. So the real question isn't how they did it. We're slowly uncovering those answers, one electron microscope at a time. The real question is, what else is still waiting to be found? Sitting quietly in a forgotten museum drawer, buried under layers of dust in an old storage room, maybe even sitting on someone's shelf, mistaken for a useless piece of metal that should have been thrown away years ago. Because history has a strange habit. We don't always lose our greatest discoveries in dramatic ways. Sometimes they disappear because someone put them in a box, wrote unknown object on the label, and forgot about them for the next 1,000 years. A machine that predicted the movements of the heavens. A material that could repair itself. A technology that disappeared so completely that we had to reinvent parts of it centuries later. And somewhere out there, there may be another object waiting for its moment. Another invention hidden in plain sight. Another piece of the past quietly reminding us that ancient humans were not primitive. They were just humans. If you enjoyed this journey through the forgotten achievements of the past, leave a comment and tell us which discovery surprised you the most. Like the video, subscribe to Paint the Ages, and join us as we uncover the stories history almost forgot. Because sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't the ones we find, they're the ones we almost lose.